Larry Eisenberg trusted his wife completely. He called her his soulmate. He shared his retirement dreams with her. On February 13, 2018, she took him on a sunrise boat ride. He never came home. What investigators discovered shocked an entire community. The woman he loved had been hiding deadly secrets. Like, subscribe, and share. The truth will disturb you. Larry Eisenberg was born and raised in the Idaho Panhandle, a region defined by its rugged mountains, dense forests, and pristine glacial lakes. From his earliest years, Larry developed a deep connection to this landscape, a bond that would shape his entire life and career. He grew up understanding the value of hard work, discipline, and honesty, principles instilled in him by his upbringing in this Pacific Northwest community. Larry pursued a career in forestry, earning a degree that allowed him to work professionally in the field he loved. His profession demanded patience, careful planning, and a profound respect for the natural world. These qualities became the foundation of his character. Colleagues and friends knew him as methodical and reliable, a man who measured twice and cut once in every aspect of his life. His children, Dean and Jessica, would later describe their father as a straight arrow, in every sense of the phrase. Larry emphasized integrity above all else, teaching his children that honesty was the most important virtue a person could possess. He led by example, demonstrating through his daily actions what it meant to live with discipline and moral clarity. Larry was known throughout his community for his frugality, not from stinginess, but from a deep sense of responsibility. He drove older trucks that he maintained himself. He fixed things around his property rather than hiring contractors. He saved meticulously for retirement, planning carefully for the years when he could enjoy the outdoors full-time without the demands of work. His communication style reflected his straightforward nature. Larry preferred direct, clear language in all his interactions. Friends and family would later confirm a telling detail. Larry never used emojis in text messages. He saw no need for them, preferring words that said exactly what he meant. As retirement approached, Larry looked forward to the future with genuine excitement. He was actively planning trips with his wife. He was maintaining his property and purchasing new parts for his truck. These were the actions of a man anticipating many good years ahead, a man who trusted the people closest to him completely. Larry Eisenberg had spent his life building a foundation of trust, but the woman he trusted most was building something else entirely, a house of cards that was about to collapse. Lori Barnes Eisenberg presented herself to the world as a woman who had overcome tremendous adversity. She spoke often of a difficult childhood marked by poverty, using her personal history to connect with the struggling families she worked to help. This narrative of triumph over hardship became central to her public identity, earning her admiration and trust throughout the community. Professionally, Lori served as executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, commonly known as the NIHC. The organization operated with a noble mission, acquiring distressed properties, renovating them, and selling them to low-income families who otherwise could not afford home ownership. It was meaningful work that made tangible differences in people's lives. Lori became the public face of this operation. She possessed genuine charisma, demonstrating skill at charming donors and managing the contractors who performed renovation work. Her organizational abilities impressed the board and community members alike. These contributions earned her significant recognition, including being named Volunteer of the Year, an honor that cemented her reputation as a selfless servant dedicated to helping others. Her personal life appeared equally admirable. Lori married Larry Eisenberg in what friends described as a late-life fairy tale. Those who knew them called the couple soulmates, marveling at their apparent devotion to each other. Lori brought 4 daughters from previous relationships into the marriage, creating a large blended family that Larry embraced wholeheartedly. Larry loved his expanded role as grandfather and family patriarch. He enjoyed the chaos and warmth of large family gatherings at their cabin, a property they affectionately called our paradise. The home represented everything they had built together, or so Larry believed. The marriage operated on a foundation of trust and divided responsibilities. Larry managed their personal finances with his characteristic discipline and attention to detail. Lori maintained complete autonomy over the Housing Coalition's finances, a separation Larry never questioned. He trusted his wife implicitly, never doubting her professional success or wondering how she contributed to their comfortable lifestyle. But behind the awards and the accolades, behind the family photos and the cabin gatherings, Lori Eisenberg was hiding a secret that was growing more dangerous by the day. Beneath Lori Eisenberg's carefully constructed facade of community service and professional excellence, a criminal enterprise had been operating for years. The embezzlement scheme she orchestrated would ultimately become the motive for murder, revealing the desperate lengths she would go to protect her secrets. The mechanics of the fraud demonstrated both audacity and cunning. Lori created a series of shell companies that appeared, on paper, to be legitimate vendors and contractors providing services to the North Idaho Housing Coalition. Board members reviewing financial documents saw what looked like normal business expenses for an organization that regularly hired workers to renovate properties. In reality, these companies existed only on paper. They were registered under the names of Lori's own daughters, sometimes with their knowledge and participation, sometimes without their awareness at all. Lori maintained control of the bank accounts associated with these phantom businesses, giving her direct access to any funds transferred to them. The scheme operated through fraudulent invoicing on a systematic basis. Lori would authorize checks from the NIHC to these fake companies, billing for work that was never actually performed or inflating the costs of legitimate services far beyond their actual value. The money flowed from the non-profit organization, through the shell companies, and directly back into Lori's control. She had created a pipeline that siphoned charitable funds intended for struggling families directly into her own pockets. Over the course of her tenure as executive director, Lori stole more than $570,000 from the organization she was trusted to lead. The stolen funds supported lifestyle upgrades and provided financial assistance to her daughters, but the scheme created problems that compounded over time. By early 2018, Lori's situation had become critical. The NIHC board was preparing for a comprehensive financial audit. Board members had begun asking questions about invoices that failed to reconcile properly. The scrutiny that Lori had avoided for years was finally arriving. Making matters worse, Larry had recently retired. He was spending more time at home and had begun to sense something was wrong with their finances. His natural attention to detail and his expectations of transparency meant discovery was increasingly likely. Lori faced an impossible position of her own creation. If the audit proceeded, her crimes would be exposed publicly. If Larry investigated their household finances, he would discover that her contributions to their lifestyle were built entirely on theft. Divorce would only accelerate the exposure of her fraud. Lori Eisenberg had stolen $500,000. Now, to keep that secret buried, she would need to bury something else: her husband. The crime that ended Larry Eisenberg's life was not an impulsive act born of sudden desperation. Digital evidence uncovered by investigators would later prove that Lori had been planning her husband's death for weeks, researching methods that might allow murder to masquerade as tragic accident. In the weeks preceding February 13, 2018, Lori traveled to Florida. During this trip, she used her computer to conduct internet searches that would become central to the prosecution's case against her. The search history revealed disturbing inquiries that painted a clear picture of premeditation. Lori had researched drowning. She had looked up information about water currents and how they affect bodies. She had searched for details about deep water and boat accidents. These were not casual searches or idle curiosity. They represented systematic research into methods of killing that could potentially be explained as accidents. The timing of these searches proved particularly significant. The Florida trip occurred weeks before the boat ride on Lake Coeur d'Alene, establishing that Lori had been contemplating water-based scenarios for ending her husband's life well in advance of the actual crime. She was not reacting to circumstances or making desperate decisions in the moment. Investigators would later characterize her behavior as shopping for a way to kill him. The digital trail showed a woman who was thinking carefully about how to commit murder and avoid detection. She was evaluating options, considering variables, and planning her approach with the same organizational skills that had earned her professional recognition. This digital evidence transformed the case fundamentally. What might have been argued as a tragic accident or even a crime of passion became undeniably a case of first-degree premeditated murder. The searches demonstrated calculation, research, and advanced planning, the unmistakable hallmarks of a cold-blooded killer methodically preparing to execute her crime. Lori Eisenberg had done her research. Now she needed the perfect setting. On February 13, 2018, she found it: a freezing lake, a romantic boat ride, and a husband who trusted her completely. February 13, 2018 began like any other winter morning in the Idaho Panhandle. The sky hung gray and heavy over Lake Coeur d'Alene, a 25-mile stretch of glacial water nestled among the mountains. In winter, the lake transforms from a summer playground into a place of cold solitude. Water temperatures hover in the low 40s Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes of immersion. Despite these inhospitable conditions, Lori Eisenberg suggested a romantic outing to her husband. She proposed a sunrise boat ride to celebrate Valentine's Day one day early. The weather was dismal and the water was dangerously cold. Larry himself was not at full strength, still recovering from a recent bout of flu that had left him weakened. Nevertheless, Larry agreed to his wife's suggestion. He was a devoted husband who trusted Lori completely, and the idea of watching the sunrise together over the lake they both loved held genuine appeal. They prepared for the outing and drove to Sunup Bay Boat Launch. They launched their boat with just the two of them aboard. There were no other witnesses on the water that morning. No cameras recorded their departure or what happened afterward. The gray expanse of Lake Coeur d'Alene swallowed them into privacy and isolation. At some point during the boat ride, Larry ingested a massive quantity of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient commonly found in Benadryl and similar over-the-counter medications. Investigators would later determine that Lori dissolved the drug in a green smoothie, a health drink she regularly prepared for Larry. The smoothie's strong flavor masked the bitter taste of the medication, allowing Larry to consume a lethal dose witut realizing anything was wrong. At 10:30 a.m., Lori Eisenberg placed a call to 911. Her voice on the recording was frantic, breathless, seemingly panicked. She told the dispatcher that the boat's motor had made a strange noise. She said Larry had gone to the back of the boat to investigate the problem. She described a sudden movement, and then claimed her husband had fallen overboard into the freezing water. Lori told the operator she had been searching for Larry for 2 hours before calling for help. She explained that she had not wanted to leave the spot where he fell, and that she had driven the boat in circles desperately looking for him. When rescuers arrived at the scene, they observed that Lori had a bloody nose. She attributed the injury to hitting her face on the boat console during her frantic search efforts. Lori Eisenberg had called for help, but the questions were already mounting. Why wait 2 hours? Why was there no water in the boat? And what really happened to Larry Eisenberg? The disappearance of Larry Eisenberg triggered an immediate emergency response from local authorities. The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office mobilized search and rescue operations within hours of receiving Lori's 911 call. The circumstances demanded urgency. A man was missing in water cold enough to kill within minutes. Divers entered the frigid depths of Lake Coeur d'Alene, searching methodically through the dark water. Sonar equipment scanned the lake floor, looking for any sign of Larry's body. The search continued for days, then weeks, as hope for finding him alive faded into the grim task of recovery. Throughout this period, the community rallied around Lori Eisenberg. Friends and neighbors saw a woman devastated by unimaginable loss. They brought casseroles and offered comfort, embracing her as a victim of terrible misfortune. The woman who had been named Volunteer of the Year now seemed to need the community's support more than ever. Lori performed the role of grieving widow with conviction. She wrote lengthy, emotional emails to friends and family members, describing in detail the accident and expressing her overwhelming heartbreak. She recounted the horror of watching Larry fall into the water. She described the bitter cold and her desperate, futile attempts to locate him. These communications served to cement her narrative before any contradicting evidence could emerge. However, investigators were quietly noting troubling inconsistencies in her account. Experienced boaters familiar with Lake Coeur d'Alene questioned the basic premise of her story. Larry was an experienced outdoorsman who had spent his career working in forests and wild places. The idea that he would simply fall out of a boat in relatively calm water seemed implausible to those who knew him. The 2-hour delay before calling 911 raised immediate red flags among investigators. In water temperatures near 40 degrees, hypothermia sets in within minutes, and death follows shortly after. No rational person would search for 2 hours without calling for professional help. The boat itself presented additional problems. Despite Lori's claims of a motor malfunction and a frantic search, the vessel was found in working order and relatively orderly. The bloody nose she attributed to hitting the console left no corresponding blood evidence on that surface. The community believed Lori Eisenberg was a grieving widow, but beneath the surface of the lake, and beneath the surface of her story, the truth was waiting to be discovered. On March 1, 2018, the waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene finally surrendered what they had been holding. Larry Eisenberg's body was recovered floating in the lake, located miles away from the position where Lori claimed he had fallen overboard. The distance itself raised immediate questions about her account of events, but the true revelations would come from the medical examination. The autopsy conducted on Larry's body delivered findings that fundamentally transformed the investigation. What had been treated as a potential accident or drowning became unmistakably a homicide case. The first critical discovery was straightforward but devastating to Lori's narrative. Larry Eisenberg had not drowned. Medical examiners found no water in his lungs, the definitive sign that would indicate death by drowning. The evidence indicated that Larry was likely already dead, or at minimum completely incapacitated, before his body ever entered the water. He had not struggled. He had not gasped for breath beneath the surface. He was gone before the lake claimed him. The second finding proved even more damning. Toxicology analysis revealed that Larry had 7,100 nanograms per milliliter of diphenhydramine in his blood at the time of death. Medical experts explained the significance of this number in stark terms. A normal therapeutic dose of diphenhydramine produces blood levels between 100 and 1,000 nanograms per milliliter. Larry had 7 times the upper limit of normal concentration circulating in his system. This level of diphenhydramine is considered lethal in virtually all cases. Medical professionals described what such a massive overdose would do to the human body, a condition called anticholinergic syndrome, characterized by delirium, hallucinations, dangerously rapid heart rate, and eventually seizures leading to coma and death. Such an enormous quantity of medication could not possibly be ingested accidentally. The bitter taste of that many crushed pills or liquid concentrate would require a powerful masking agent to make consumption possible. The green smoothie that Lori regularly prepared for Larry provided exactly that kind of disguise. The official cause of death was ruled diphenhydramine toxicity. The medical evidence was unambiguous. Larry Eisenberg had been deliberately poisoned by his own wife. The autopsy had revealed the truth. Larry Eisenberg was murdered. But even as investigators built their case, Another investigation was uncovering crimes that would expose the motive behind the killing. While divers searched the cold depths of Lake Coeur d'Alene for Larry's body, another investigation was proceeding simultaneously. The North Idaho Housing Coalition had launched the financial audit that Lori had long feared, and what investigators discovered in those records would provide the crucial motive for murder. The audit revealed systematic fraud on a massive scale. Investigators found forged checks bearing signatures that did not match authorized personnel. They discovered the phantom companies registered to Lori's daughter's businesses that existed only on paper to receive payments for work never performed. They traced the flow of funds from the charitable organization through these shell entities and back to Lori's control. The total amount stolen exceeded $570,000. On February 26, 2018, just 2 weeks after Larry's disappearance and 3 days before his body was recovered, the NIHC board took decisive action. They terminated Lori's employment immediately and contacted law enforcement. The woman celebrated as Volunteer of the Year was now exposed as a thief who had systematically stolen from an organization dedicated to helping impoverished families achieve homeownership. The community's sympathy for the grieving widow evaporated instantly. People who had brought casseroles and offered comfort now recoiled in disgust. The transformation from victim to villain was swift and complete. Lori was arrested and charged with grand theft and forgery related to the embezzlement scheme. She posted bail and was released, but her legal troubles were only beginning. With the autopsy results confirming murder by poisoning, investigators now possessed both the evidence of the crime and a clear motive for why it was committed. The financial crimes explained everything. Lori had killed Larry to prevent him from discovering her embezzlement. She had killed him to avoid the exposure that an audit would bring. She had killed him to collect his life insurance and retirement savings, funds she desperately needed as her scheme collapsed. As the murder case built against her, Lori took desperate action. She liquidated assets and transferred money. Then she disappeared entirely, becoming a fugitive from justice. Her flight was short-lived. She eventually surrendered to authorities, apparently recognizing that escape was impossible. Lori Eisenberg was now facing charges for theft, fraud, and murder. But she had one more scheme left, an attempt to rob Larry Eisenberg even from beyond the grave. Even facing charges for theft and murder, Lori Eisenberg could not stop scheming. Investigators discovered that she had attempted to manipulate Larry's estate after his death, demonstrating that her pattern of fraud and deception continued unabated despite the severity of her legal situation. The evidence centered on Larry's will. The original document had been drafted by Larry himself, reflecting his values of fairness and family responsibility. The will divided his assets equitably among his children and Lori's daughters, ensuring that everyone in their blended family would receive an inheritance. It was the kind of balanced, thoughtful document that matched Larry's character. But handwritten modifications had been made to the will after Larry's disappearance. These alterations attempted to fundamentally restructure the distribution of his estate. The changes sought to redirect 80% of Larry's assets to Lori's daughters, effectively disinheriting Larry's own children, Dean and Jessica. The attempted fraud was crude in execution. The mathematical calculations in the modifications were incorrect. The handwriting appeared shaky and inconsistent. Most importantly, the changes violated basic legal requirements for valid amendments to a will. No legitimate attorney would have accepted these modifications as binding. Digital forensics provided additional evidence of the fraud. Investigators discovered that computer files related to the will had been created or modified after Larry's disappearance. These timestamps provided clear proof of when the alterations were made and who was responsible for making them. The forged will became another piece of evidence illuminating Lori's character. Even after killing her husband, she was still attempting to steal from him. Even after taking his life, she sought to take his legacy from his children. She viewed people as assets to be exploited, resources to be extracted, even in death. Lori Eisenberg had tried to steal Larry's money while he was alive. She had killed him to protect that theft. And now she had tried to steal his legacy from his children. But justice was finally catching up. Among the evidence compiled against Lori Eisenberg, one small detail proved particularly revealing. A text message sent from Larry's phone became a digital fingerprint that helped establish her guilt and expose her attempts to create a false narrative. Police examined Larry's cellular phone, which had remained in Lori's possession after his disappearance. Their analysis revealed that a text message had been sent from Larry's device to one of Lori's daughters. The timing of this message was significant. It was transmitted shortly after the time Lori claimed Larry had fallen overboard into the freezing water. The content of the message attracted immediate investigator attention. The text contained an emoji, one of the small digital images commonly used in casual electronic communication. When investigators interviewed Larry's friends and family members about his communication habits, they received consistent and emphatic responses. Every person who knew Larry well confirmed the same fact. Larry Eisenberg never used emojis. He was a man who valued clear, direct communication. He preferred words that expressed exactly what he meant without embellishment or decoration. The use of emojis was simply not part of his communication style. This small detail carried enormous evidentiary weight. The emoji was a digital fingerprint that did not belong to Larry. It belonged to someone else. Someone who was attempting to simulate Larry's activity on his phone after he was already incapacitated or dead. The text message proved that Lori had possession of Larry's phone during the critical time period. It demonstrated her calculated attempt to create false evidence suggesting Larry was still alive and communicating normally. The evidence was overwhelming. The poison, the searches, the fraud, the forged will, and now the text message. Lori Eisenberg would have to answer for her crimes. But first, she would try one more lie. Confronted with irrefutable scientific evidence that Larry Eisenberg had died from diphenhydramine poisoning, Lori could no longer maintain her original story. The claim that Larry had simply fallen overboard could not explain the lethal levels of medication in his bloodstream. She needed a new narrative, one that acknowledged the drugs while deflecting blame from herself. Her solution was a story so implausible that it insulted the intelligence of everyone who heard it. Lori claimed that she and Larry had both been suffering from depression. She asserted that she, not Larry, had wanted to end her own life. According to this revised account, she had prepared the lethal drink with the intention of committing suicide. In this new version of events, Larry had accidentally consumed the poisoned smoothie that Lori had prepared for herself. The death was a tragic mistake, she claimed, not a murder. She further asserted that after Larry ingested the poison, rather than calling for emergency medical help, she had taken him out on the boat so he could die in the place he loved. She then placed his body in the water. The prosecution systematically demolished this defense. Larry Eisenberg displayed no indicators of depression in the weeks and months before his death. He was actively making plans for the future. He was maintaining his property and working on projects around his home. He had recently purchased new parts for his truck. These were the actions of a man looking forward to life, not someone contemplating death. Furthermore, the suggestion that Lori herself was suicidal defied credibility. This was a woman who had spent years stealing money to fund her lifestyle, fighting desperately to maintain her comfortable existence. The idea that she would suddenly choose to end her life strained belief beyond breaking. Even accepting her story at face value, it still described criminal conduct. She had administered a lethal substance to her husband. She had failed to call for medical assistance when he consumed it. She had disposed of his body in a lake. These actions constituted serious crimes regardless of her claimed intentions. The suicide pact defense was recognized for what it truly was, a final desperate attempt by a narcissist to cast herself as the victim. Lori Eisenberg's lies had finally run out. Now she would face judgment, not just from the court, but from the family she had destroyed. The legal proceedings against Lori Eisenberg moved slowly through the court system, delayed by the complexity of multiple criminal charges and external factors, including the global pandemic. Finally, the case reached its resolution in early 2021, years after Larry's death on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Rather than face a jury trial that would almost certainly result in conviction for first-degree murder, Lori Eisenberg made a calculated legal decision. She entered an Alford plea to the charge of second-degree murder. This specific legal mechanism allowed her to acknowledge that prosecutors possessed sufficient evidence to secure a conviction without requiring her to actually admit guilt. It was a way to accept punishment while avoiding the words that would constitute a confession. She also entered guilty pleas to federal wire fraud and theft charges, stemming from her embezzlement of funds from the North Idaho Housing Coalition. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for those most affected by Lori's crimes to address the court directly. Larry's children, Dean and Jessica, delivered victim impact statements that laid bare the devastation their family had suffered. They spoke of their father as their moral compass, a man whose integrity had guided their own lives. They described a man who had worked hard for everything he possessed, only to be murdered by the woman he trusted most completely. Dean addressed the court with words that captured the essence of his father's character and the magnitude of his loss. He stated simply that Larry was the most honest man he had ever known. He told the judge that his father did not deserve to die the way he did. The family expressed profound frustration at never receiving a full confession. The Alford plea meant Lori would never speak the words acknowledging what she had done. This denial of truth added another layer of pain to their grief. Larry's children had spoken for their father, but the most shocking testimony was yet to come from Lori's own daughters. The sentencing proceedings revealed the full scope of destruction that Lori Eisenberg's crimes had caused. The damage extended far beyond Larry and his children. It had shattered her own family as completely as it had shattered his. Perhaps the most shocking moment of the entire legal process came not from prosecutors or from Larry's grieving family. It came from Lori's own daughters, the children she had raised, the women whose names she had used to create her fraudulent shell companies. Several of her daughters chose to speak publicly, and their words were devastating. They stood before the court and distanced themselves from their mother in the most absolute terms possible. One daughter stated clearly and without equivocation that they did not stand by her. The daughters had discovered the full truth about how their mother had used them. Their names and personal identities had been exploited to establish the shell companies through which Lori funneled stolen money. Some daughters had been completely unaware that their identities were being used for criminal purposes. Others had participated in minor capacities without understanding the true scope of the fraud they were enabling. All of them now confronted an awful reality. Their mother had jeopardized their futures, their reputations, and potentially their legal standing to feed her own greed. She had used her children as tools for theft, treating them as instruments rather than people deserving of protection. The family that had once gathered at the cabin they called Paradise was now irreparably fractured. Larry's children had lost their father to murder. Lori's daughters had lost their mother to her own crimes and moral failures. The blended family that had seemed like a late-life fairy tale was revealed as a foundation built on deception and exploitation. Lori Eisenberg had destroyed two families, Larry's and her own. Now the judge would determine how she would spend the rest of her life. The judge presiding over Lori Eisenberg's sentencing had reviewed the complete record of evidence compiled against her. He had examined the premeditated internet searches conducted during her Florida trip. He had studied the toxicology reports documenting the massive lethal dose of diphenhydramine in Larry's blood. He had considered the inexplicable 2-hour delay before Lori called for emergency assistance. He had reviewed the forged will and its clumsy attempt to disinherit Larry's children. He had examined the text message with the emoji that Larry would never have sent. He had traced the flow of more than $500,000 stolen dollars through phantom companies and back to Lori's control. The judge saw calculation in every element of the case. He saw meticulous planning and cold execution. He saw a woman who had murdered her husband to protect her financial crimes and profit from his death. He was unmoved by Lori's tears during the proceedings, or her continued suggestions that Larry's death was somehow accidental. The sentence reflected the severity of her crimes. Lori Eisenberg received a life sentence in prison with a minimum of 30 years fixed before any possibility of parole consideration. Given her age at the time of sentencing, 67 years old, this effectively constituted a death sentence. She would not become eligible for parole until the year 2050. At which point she would be 97 years old. The federal charges resulted in an additional 5-year sentence for theft and fraud, ordered to run concurrently with her murder sentence. The court also mandated that she pay restitution to the North Idaho Housing Coalition for the funds she had embezzled from the organization she was trusted to lead. Lori Eisenberg would spend the remainder of her life behind prison walls, but the story she left behind would serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a trusted face.